Okay, it's the time to start. Today, Professor Williamson will give his fourth lecture, Philosophy and Thought Experiment. Before this, I say a few words. 石昭清 said to me, some people, some audience wants to ask questions. I have to explain something about this. There are thousands of audience. How many people? If let some people ask questions, who? I choose who? So many. Also, the time is very limited. So right now, I just figure out a solution. Before regular procedure, I open one question from our special group in this room. Your special group to one person ask one question, just one question. Not too long, short. In this way, maybe the whole procedure extend 10 minutes. Then we'll end up at 9:10. Okay? Understand me? So in our Zoom group, a large person can ask one question. Okay? Now the time is, yes. Tim, you can start.
Okay, thank you. So today I'm going to be talking about philosophy and thought experiments. And as I was discussing last time, of course, experiments play a central role in the success of modern natural science, and that's one of the reasons for which the scientific revolution has created what I called a crisis of philosophical method, or one time created. And so it's relevant to talk about whether philosophy has got anything similar to experiments in natural science. Do experiments play any role in philosophy? Now, one role that they do play is a relatively straightforward one, and in fact just involves the same experiments that natural science does.
Some people said your slides are not showing.
Oh,
some people you also said Redlowski said I can see the slides. Maybe, yeah. Okay. Maybe our regular.
Is it okay now? Because I'm. It all seems. I mean, I'm sharing my screen, and I can, and the slide seems is perfectly normal. So I'm not sure what is different this time.
Okay.
Shall I
okay.
I'll continue. Yeah, I as far as I can see, it's all just the same as usual. So maybe they have some problem in connecting. But if there's something I can do, you tell me. So one of the things that I argued in lecture 1 was that all scientific knowledge is part of the evidence base for philosophy, because all knowledge is part of that evidence base. There's no requirement on philosophy that its evidence has to be purely a priori, purely the result of some kind of reflection, independent of experience or anything like that. And at contemporary philosophy, you see that it does draw on natural science in various ways. So, for example, when we're discussing the philosophy of space and time, it would be very natural to draw on theories in physics, such as Einstein's theory of special relativity. There's no bar on doing that, and in fact, you can see in debates on issues in metaphysics, for example, about whether only the present is real, that people appeal to special relativity. And similarly, in the philosophy of perception, it's quite normal for philosophers to draw on theories in psychology. And these theories from physics or psychology or whatever branch of science is relevant, they themselves are supported by experimental evidence, of course. So indirectly, the philosophical theories which draw on them are using the experimental evidence, because they're using theories that are based on that experimental evidence. And so in that sense, there's a fairly clear, though indirect, way in which many philosophical theories are drawing on experimental evidence. But what I want to talk about today is more to do with whether there are experiments which are done by philosophers themselves, rather than just, as it were, using other people's experiments. And you know, an obvious thing to say is that most philosophers don't, as it were, do what you might call real experiments, the kind that require, for example, a laboratory or something like that. Philosophers are much more likely to do thought experiments. And these thought experiments have a very long history. So in Western philosophy, thought experiments go back at least to Plato. So, for example, he talks about Gaiji's ring of invisibility, a ring when you wear it, it makes you invisible, and about whether people who had such a ring would behave morally, or because they could escape punishment if they did wrong. So that's already a thought experiment. I guess in a way concerning psychology as well as philosophy. But I mean, there are many such examples throughout the history of Western philosophy. But it's not only Western philosophy. So, for example, thought experiments also figure in ancient Indian philosophy. For those of you who know about the thought experiments in epistemology by Edmund Gettier, they're actually forerunners of those thought experiments, which were known in ancient Indian philosophy. And I'm interested to hear at some point, perhaps, about whether thought experiments played a role in ancient Chinese philosophy. I mean, it seems that various kinds of stories or fables were significant there, and perhaps some of those played the role of thought experiments. I'm not sure, but it'd be interesting to hear from somebody who knows more about ancient Chinese philosophy than I do, which is very easy to do. So thought experiments are now a standard technique in contemporary analytic philosophy. And I mean, they play various different roles, but one role is often to provide counterexamples to generalizations. But we shouldn't be thinking of these thought experiments as something that is distinctive just of philosophy, because thought experiments are also quite common in natural science. And in fact, I think the phrase thought experiment used to be used mainly about the scientific ones rather than the philosophical ones. So, Galileo used a thought experiment to argue against Aristotle's theory of motion. And Einstein asked what would happen if you rode on a light beam. So those are thought experiments which played some role in the history of physics. But it's certainly puzzling at first to understand how thought experiments work. So if you're concerned, let's say, with a generalization like all swans are white, and you actually find a black swan in Tasmania or wherever, then of course that black swan is a counterexample to the generalization that you're interested in. But if you simply imagine a black swan, you've imagined a counterexample to all swans are white, but you don't actually have a counterexample to all swans are white. So what exactly is supposed to be the role of imagining here? Well, I think one obvious point is that if we were concerned not just with a generalization that all swans are white, which is simply a generalization about, as were, swans in the actual world. If we were concerned with a necessitated generalization, like one saying that necessarily all swans are white, then maybe imagining a black swan would give you a counterexample, because it might somehow give you an argument for the possibility of black swans. And if a black swan is possible, then it's not true that necessarily all swans are white. But we need to be clearer about what that connection is between imagination and possibility. And that's just an aspect of a more general question, which is, what is the cognitive role of imagination? And when we ask that, I think it's useful to take on a distinction which is well known in the philosophy of science and was made by Hans Reichenbach, who distinguished between the context of discovery and the context of justification. So the context of discovery is the context in which an idea is first thought of, while the context of justification is the context in which the idea's correctness is tested. So, I mean, for example, you might first think of an idea when you were drunk, or it might even come to you in a dream when you're asleep. But it seems that once you've got the idea, you still need to test whether it's actually correct or not, and that's not something which you should be doing when you're drunk or asleep. It seems that's a stage at which you need your full powers of rationality. So I think what is easy to agree and obvious is that the imagination plays a central role in the context of discovery. A scientist with no imagination is obviously not going to be able to come up with really new ideas or something like that. So that part is uncontroversial. I think the hard and interesting question is, does imagination play a role in the context of justification too? So not simply in enabling you to have the idea in the first place, but in aiding you in actually testing the idea to see whether it's correct or not. And of course, if thought experiments really provide counterexamples to generalization, then that means that in some way the imagination does play a role in the context of justification too, because, well, the imagination, of course, is being used in the thought experiments, presumably, and if those thought experiments are providing counterexamples, then that's a role in the context of justification. That has to do with testing the correctness of a generalization, and in this case, coming to a negative conclusion with a counterexample. So what I want to do now is just to say a little bit about the general cognitive role of imagination, and how we use it in sometimes just ordinary life, in something like the context of justification, because often when people think of the imagination, they think of the imagination's role in fiction and play and fantasy, where the imagination is running completely free of, or it seems free of, any kind of cognitive role. And so it might seem strange to think of the imagination as playing a cognitive role. But I think if you consider how, for example, we assess conditional statements, then I think you can see that the imagination does play a significant role. So suppose that you're assessing the statement that if TW sneezes, the lecture will continue. Actually, just now I coughed, but then the natural thing for you to do, I mean, you can't, I don't think, as far as I know, even online, there probably isn't, there aren't some statistics about what happens in lectures when the lecturer sneezes. But I mean, the natural way to assess that statement would be to imagine me sneezing, and then to think, well, is that the kind of thing that will end the lecture? And I think it's obvious that it wouldn't. It's just a trivial interruption, and the lecture would continue. Whereas if you take the conditional, if TW is kidnapped by bandits, the lecture will continue. If you imagine me being carried away by bandits, then the lecture would not continue. I mean, the bandits wouldn't allow me to continue lecturing as they drove me off, and so they're just with a couple of somewhat random everyday conditionals. It seems that we can quite easily assess them, that the first is correct and the second is not correct, by using the imagination. Sorry, I'm getting some interference, but on the sound, but I think that's just an accident. So, or just to take an example which doesn't have to do with anything like human decisions, if you take the two conditionals, if salt is put in a glass of water, it will dissolve. and if salt is put in an empty glass, it will dissolve. I think that it's easy to see that if you know anything about salt and water, that the first of those is correct. But if the glass is totally empty, then the salt that's put in it will not dissolve. And again, I think we could do that just by the imagination. And of course, in all these cases, it's possible to imagine the opposite outcome. So it's possible for you to imagine that I sneeze and that somehow I'm so upset by my sneezing that I can't continue the lecture. And it would be possible for you to imagine me being kidnapped by bandits, and somehow the bandits let me continue the lecture as they drive me away. So you could certainly, in both cases, it's possible to imagine the opposite outcome. But that's not the way that we normally use the imagination in assessing conditionals. We use it in a way which is much more reality-oriented, and which is somehow, as it were, following out the initial scenario that's given us by the if part of the sentence, in the way that we expect things to happen. And the way we do, reason why we do this with the imagination rather than using deductive logic or something, is because a lot of our connection, or cognitive connection with the world, is stored in, as it were, the way we're disposed to continue scenarios rather than in explicit generalizations from which we could deduce the outcome. So, I mean, thinking of things a little bit more abstractly, when we're assessing a conditional statement of the form if P then Q, the typical way to assess it is by supposing P and then imaginatively developing P's likely consequences in the kind of reality-oriented way that I was explaining, and then assessing Q on the imagined scenario. So that we've got these two roles of the imagination here. One is, as it were, under voluntary control, which is imagining the P, and then we just decide to imagine that because that's the scenario that we're interested in. But the other is largely involuntary. It has to do with imagining what would happen next given P, and that's where we let our sense of reality take over. And then there's a kind of heuristic that we use in order to determine our attitude to the conditional, which is, roughly speaking, that we take the same attitude to the conditional that we take to the antecedent, to the consequent, the Q part, on the supposition of the antecedent, the P part. So if we accept Q on the supposition P, so as it were, conditionally accepting it, we also accept the conditional if P then Q. And if we reject Q on the supposition P, we also reject the conditional if P then Q. And if we're neutral about Q on the supposition P, then we're also neutral about the conditional if P then Q. This may sound rather trivial, but in fact, this is a very, very non-trivial heuristic, and in certain circumstances, it can also be a problematic one. But it seems to be the way that we kind of instinctively answer questions about conditionals when we don't have some special extra kind of information, like maybe somebody told us which of them is true or something. And And I think one way of seeing how reality-oriented this is that the imaginative process of assessing Q on the supposition P is quite similar to the real-time process of assessing Q when one has just learned P, for example, by being told P by an informant. So for example, if you suddenly learn that that some politician has been taken ill, let's say, and then you're thinking about what the consequences are. You just learned it by being told it. Then the way that you develop that that new information is very similar to what you would do if you just imagine what would happen if such and such a politician were taken ill. So that there's a strong connection between the use of imagination in assessing conditionals and the real-time process of updating one's beliefs on new information. And so this kind of imaginative process we have of for assessing conditionals is also an offline version of updating our beliefs on new information, for example, gained by testimony. And this is very closely related to what is known in the work on conditionals as the Ramsey test, named after Frank Ramsey, who proposed this kind of test for conditionals. And so, roughly speaking, we're reliable in the way that we update our beliefs on new information. When we think, what else do I have to update given this piece of new information? If we're good at doing that, and our updating tends to be accurate, then we're likely to be correspondingly reliable about the acceptance of conditionals, given the close relation between the two. So that those considerations show how the role of the imagination in assessing conditionals is actually quite reality-oriented, quite closely related to updating, and so it's not really surprising that we have the imagination playing a cognitive role, and not just a role in the context of discovery, a role in the context of justification, because it's actually playing a role in assessing the correctness or incorrectness of these conditionals. Now, for the application to thought experiments, we actually need to distinguish between different kinds of conditionals. And I believe that this is a way in which English is different from Chinese, particularly Mandarin, that what in English is shown by a difference in the form of the verbs is in Chinese, I'm told, and I'm quite willing to be corrected, I'm told is conveyed by context rather than by the verbal form. But anyway, I'll explain the distinction in English, and I believe that a similar distinction can be made in Chinese, but as I say, but by context, not by verbal form. So one kind of conditional is the what's often called the indicative. So an example would be, if my enemies tried to kill me yesterday, they failed. And that's obviously true because I'm alive. Here I am giving my lecture. So obviously they didn't succeed in killing me because if they had, I wouldn't be giving the lecture. There's a different kind of conditional called the counterfactual conditional, like 2, which says, if my enemies had tried to kill me yesterday, they would have failed. And 2 is not at all obviously true, because maybe my enemies are very efficient and powerful, and so if they had tried to kill me yesterday, they would have succeeded. But of course, I know, since I'm alive, it means that they didn't try to kill me yesterday. So those two conditionals are working in quite different ways, and the difference could roughly be put, I mean, this is only approximate, by saying that in some way the counterfactuals bracket actuality in a way indicatives do not. So that when we assess one, we keep hold of the fact that we're talking about the actual world in which I'm here giving the lecture. And so given that, it's obvious that my enemies didn't succeed in killing me yesterday. Whereas with the counterfactual, we don't hold it fixed that I'm alive today, because we're not, as it were, in some sense, we're not bound to be talking about the actual world. We're just talking about whatever possible world it would be where my enemies did try to kill me yesterday. And we may grant that is not and that's not the actual world. It may be some quite different world. And so with counterfactuals, there's a kind of distancing from the actual world that you don't have with indicatives. And that makes counterfactuals more suitable than indicatives for thought experiments. Because in a thought experiment, we don't want kind of interference from what's happening in the actual world. We just want to consider what happens in this possible world. It may be a very science fiction kind of world where the scenario holds. And so that means that when we're trying to apply the kind of lessons that we learned about the cognitive role of the imagination and assessing conditionals to thought experiments, the relevant kind of conditionals for the imagination to be assessing are counterfactuals. But the imagination does seem to play a very significant role, at least in ordinary cases, with both indicative and counterfactual conditionals. It's just that it works in slightly different ways in the two cases. So I'm now just going to go through a kind of a toy example. And so I'm going to be working with a very simplified case, just so that the structure of what's going on is relatively clear. So I'm just going to suppose that we have some claim made by some moral philosophers, and that they say necessarily any action is good if after it all living people feel happy. I mean, I'm not. It's not that I accept that claim. It's just this is a claim that, as it were, a theory in moral philosophy that we're going to assess by a thought experiment. And now here's a scenario that someone who doesn't like that theory might come up with. And this is a scenario that we're going to counterfactually suppose in the imagination. So just to keep things simple, let's suppose that there are only two people, and one of them is a sadist. So the sadist, in the scenario, the sadist murders the non-sadist and feels very happy about it. Now, what we want to do is to assess whether that action would be good in the scenario. So we're just supposing the scenario in imagination, and we sort of assuming that scenario, imagining that's the case. a judgment that we could make is after the murder, all living people felt happy. There was only one living person after the murder, that was the sadist, and so that's more or less just implied by the description of the scenario. But I think we would, it seems natural to judge that the murder was not good. The action was not a good action, even though after it, all living people felt happy. Just the one living person that there was. So not good is a judgment that we make on the counterfactual supposition of scenario. It's made on a supposition because it's saying that something happened after the murder, but of course in actuality there perhaps was no such murder. So this is just made under the supposition of the scenario. And then we apply the kind of heuristic that I explained before to make a judgment on the of the conditional. So, and the conditional is if scenario were to hold, not good would also hold. So that's a counterfactual conditional, and that's one that we can unconditionally accept. I mean, the not good itself, when we just make it as a categorical judgment, is made under a counterfactual supposition of scenario. But final verdict is not made under a counterfactual supposition. It's just made unconditionally. And so we get that if the scenario were to hold, not good would also hold. And this is obviously going to be relevant to the original claim, the original theory that we're assessing. But we actually do need to be quite careful about how the relevance works. So we seem to have a counterexample to final verdict. The final verdict seems to be a counterexample to that claim that we were considering. But we have to think about how that works. And the first thing to say is that the scenario is a counterexample to the claim only if scenario is possible. Because if I came up with an impossible situation where, on the basis of which we judged that there was a problem for the theory, if it was just in an impossible situation, that wouldn't matter, because the theory is saying necessarily, but necessarily just means something like in all possible situations, and so we're not interested in what happens in an impossible situation. We don't care about that. But I think it's pretty clear that scenario, that situation with the sadist and the non-sadist and the murder, it's possible. I mean, it's at least metaphysically possible. It's something that could, in principle, have been the case. I mean, it doesn't mean that we could, from a practical point of view, bring it about, but it's possible. It's possible, and so since we had the final verdict, which said that if scenario were to obtain, not good would also obtain. It seems that as it were, the possibility of the scenario will transmit to the not good, and if not good is possible, then that it logically follows that claim is false, because not good is a case where there's a counterexample to claim. And so if it's possible to have not good, then since claim is making a statement about all possible situations, it says necessarily so-and-so, then the possibility of not good will logically entail the falsity of claim, which is what we wanted, because we were looking for a counterexample. And so we have a counterexample to claim. So we were able to extract from these conditional considerations, a counterexample to the original theory that we imagine some silly moral philosopher putting forward. And there's actually a bit of reasoning that's going on here, which is the move from the possibility of scenario to the possibility of not good by the counterfactual conditional final verdict. And so, so we've been doing a piece of reasoning which goes from some X could hold, and if X were to hold, Y would hold, that Y also could hold, where the could, it corresponds to a claim of possibility. So that's form of reasoning involving X and Y here. This reasoning is valid because the counterfactual conditional in effect says that in every relevant possibility where X holds, Y holds. And so the premise X could hold that gives us a relevant possibility where X holds, and therefore Y also holds in that relevant possibility. So this is good reasoning, but we do need to think about how exactly it's working. But of course, all of that argumentation, it pushes the question back to how we know that scenario is possible. That scenario is the initial situation with the sadist and the non-sadist and then the murder, which we then make moral judgment about. And it seemed fairly obvious that scenario was possible, but we still need to think about how we know that. Well, if scenario were impossible, then if it's impossible, then every counterfactual of the form, if scenario were to hold, then Z would hold, is vacuously true. That means it's true not for any interesting reason, but just because there can't be a counterexample to it, because there are no relevant possibilities where scenario holds, and therefore there are none where scenario holds, but Z doesn't hold. And so all we need to do is, sorry, there's a mistake in the handout here. It says identify a false scenario of that form. What we need is what we should say is a false proposition, a conditional proposition about scenario of that form. And that's fairly easy to find, because you can have an example like if scenario were to hold, then 1 + 1 = 17 would also hold. And that's obviously false. The situation where scenario holds is not a situation where 1 + 1 = 17. And so we've got a false counterfactual conditional of the form if scenario were to hold, Z would hold, and that means that scenario is not impossible. Because if it were impossible, all the counterfactual conditionals which started with it would be vacuously, trivially true. And so if we apply whatever skills we have in judging counterfactual conditionals to realize that this strange one, if scenario were to hold 1 + 1 = 17 would also hold. If we apply it to judge that that's false, and we come to know that that conditional is false, then we can also come to know that scenario is possible. So given that we have the skill in assessing counterfactual conditionals by offline thinking, it's going to be enough to make thought experiments work. And that's important because I think philosophers have often thought of thought experiments as much more mysterious than they really are, as if thought experiments involved some strange faculty that we have which somehow enables our minds to travel to possible worlds, as it were, or some weird thing of that kind. Whereas really all that's needed is the kind of skill that you need in order to be able to assess counterfactual conditionals. And counterfactual conditionals, they're not something particularly philosophical or anything. They're things that we use all the time in everyday life. So that if we have the skill to assess them, then we have the skill to do these thought experiments too, in principle, because the thought experiments don't really require anything more than some skill in assessing counterfactual conditionals, which seems like the kind of, as it were, a common sense kind of faculty, not something by any means exclusive to philosophers. So that's my account of how it, at least in simple cases, thought experiments work, how they can give us knowledge of possibilities, not by any mysterious philosophical means, but just by our ordinary cognitive capacities to assess counterfactual conditionals. But I now want to talk about a challenge to thought experiments, which is also relevant for this lecture, not only because it concerns thought experiments, but also because it concerns, as it were, so-called real experiments as well. So in a double way, it concerns the question of experiments in philosophy. So there's a paper from 2001 by Weinberg, Nichols, and Stitch, where people who describe themselves as experimental philosophers have attacked the use of thought experiments in philosophy. And they have described using thought experiments in philosophy as, they call it reliance on philosophical intuitions. So that's a very different description of what is happening in a thought experiment from the one that I've been giving, which didn't mention intuitions, at least as such. And so I want to talk about this critique. And what they did was some real life experiments where they actually elicited the verdicts of medium-sized samples of people, mostly not professional philosophers, often, in fact, philosophy students, but on variations of thought experiments used by philosophers, because they wanted to see whether the judgments that philosophers make about thought experiments are widely shared by other people, the judgments that professional philosophers make about them. And in particular, the judgments that professional philosophers in the West make about these thought experiments. And I think they might add male professional philosophers. Now, the results of their experiments seem to show quite a lot of variation in the verdicts that people gave on thought experiments according to ethnicity and gender, so that the people of Chinese or generally Eastern Asian origin, according to them, were responding in a different way to people in the West, and women were responding in a different way to men. And so that suggested that the kind of agreement on the right verdict to give on thought experiments, which professional philosophers had come to, was just an artifact of the demography of the profession, about which sort of people went into the profession. It might also be, to some extent, a matter of social conditioning within the profession to accept certain answers. And that anyway, that it was being much too affected by circumstances that were not relevant to the verdict on the case to be reliable. So that critique of the use of thought experiments is called the negative program of XPhi, of experimental philosophy, in short. So much of XPhi uses similar methods to investigate what you might call the contours of philosophical intuitions, as well, just to find out what kind of judgments what kind of judgments ordinary people make about various sorts of hypothetical case, for example, about whether some action was intentional or not. Not using it to criticize the thought experiments, but just to find out more extensively what, as it were, the relevant variables are, which are affecting people's judgment about the verdict about whether some action was good or whether it was intentional, or whether one event caused another, whatever it happened to be. So when it's not used with that critical intent, the experimental philosophy is often known as the positive program. But although the negative program might not have been the most common part of XPhi, it was the most high-profile part, because it was calling into question a fairly central philosophical method. Now, I would say that the negative program looked considerably more threatening to mainstream philosophy 10 years ago than it does now. And one of the main reasons for that is that when the experiments were repeated and were done more rigorously, with more attention to the kind of confines of kind of things that can give you utterly misleading results, which experimental psychologists are very aware of, but which, as were philosophers entering this area for the first time, they didn't fully realize all the pitfalls. And actually, and quite a lot of that work was done in China, especially I think Hong Kong, and so when these experiments were repeated, or at least similar experiments, they didn't find the same kind of variation on the whole, and one reason why they didn't find the original variation may be that the level of motivation of the people involved with the original thought experiments was varying according to those, as it were, irrelevant factors. So, for example, a lot of the Chinese students in American universities are working. They're doing a science or technology major, but these experiments where the students were asked what they thought of these thought experiments, they would have been done on students in, maybe an introductory philosophy class, and a whole lot of science or technology majors may have been in the class doing it as a distribution requirement in the way that American degrees involve. And so they were there not because they were really interested in philosophy, but because they had to do a philosophy course or a humanities course. And so they happened to be doing this one. And so if people are not highly motivated, they tend to answer close to random, because they don't care. So they just write down any old thing to fill the form in as quickly as possible. And it's a well-known feature of psychological experiments that, on the whole, the less motivated people are to answer the questions, the closer they come to answering them at random, which is not very surprising. And so if most of the people of, let's say, Chinese origin in these classes were in fact science majors who were bored with the philosophy class, they may have been giving answers that were different simply because they were not motivated by the questions. And that would show nothing about the correctness or incorrectness and of the original judgments on the thought experiments made by philosophers. I mean, there are other cases where the similar results were obtained on retesting, but where people who did not have philosophical training were being asked questions where the questions involve sort of technical philosophical notions like reference from the philosophy of language or something, and those are unsafe for a different reason, because they may not be using the same notion that philosophers are using when they understand, when they read the same questions. So as far as I can see, on the whole, the new cross-cultural evidence suggests that verdicts on thought experiments often reflect something like universal human cognitive capacities. For example, our capacity to ascribe knowledge and ignorance to other people. Now, I think another important aspect of the critique which needs to be questioned is the description of the method that was being used, because the description that the experimental philosophers gave of the verdicts on thought experiments, for example, let's say the verdict that, oh yes, that would be wrong to do that murder or whatever. They were described as relying on philosophical intuitions, and I don't think that at the time it was so unfair of experimental philosophers to describe the verdicts in that way, because even people who were in favor of thought experiments often talked about the verdicts as philosophical intuitions. But I think when you probe what's going on with thought experiments, describing them in that way turns out to be extremely misleading. So if we go back to the example that I gave before, the philosophical intuition is just the unreflective judgment, not good, made on the supposition of scenario. Remember, that's the judgment that the murder is bad, not good. So that judgment on the kind of account that I've been giving, it's just an offline application of the human capacity to make moral judgments. I mean, if you're actually faced in real life with the sadist murdering the non-sadist, you would say that the murder was bad, and then if you don't, as well, experience it in real life, but you just think about a hypothetical imagined scenario where that happens, you make the same judgment about it, but offline, and that's just an ordinary moral judgment. I mean, it's a judgment that the murder is bad. And there's nothing specially philosophical about that, because it's not only philosophers who make moral judgments. I mean, almost everyone condemns murder. That's just a very, very common kind of moral judgment. And so describing it as a philosophical intuition is extremely misleading, because there's nothing specifically philosophical about it. And in fact, if you look at scenarios where, in thought experiments about epistemological cases, then the judgment is often, for example, something in the form so-and-so does not know that it's 3 o'clock, or whatever the example involves. And saying that somebody doesn't know that it's 3 o'clock, that's not a philosopher's judgment particularly. I mean, it involves the verb know, but that's just an ordinary word that we use all the time. As when we say things like, sorry, I didn't know that you were waiting for me or something, and so you don't need to be a philosopher to make a judgment like that. So, and the fact that these are made about imagined cases rather than experienced one is not really the central issue, because there's no special reason why our offline judgments of such cases should be less reliable than our online judgments of similar actually reported cases. And if our online judgments are unreliable, then our offline judgments are likely to be unreliable too. But I mean, for example, if we're very bad at determining what's morally good or morally bad, then when we do thought experiments about it, we'll be bad at them too, but we'll often give similarly inaccurate answers. But that would just be a problem for human morality in general. It wouldn't be something specific to philosophy. And it's not something to do with the role of imagination in thought experiments. So if in general, if there's a domain where in real life we're very bad at making judgments about examples of it, then of course that will apply to thought experiments as well. But that's not the kind of skepticism that experimental philosophers intended to apply. They intended a kind of very specifically targeted skepticism about philosophers' judgments in thought experiments. But we've seen the content of these judgments really is just it's relevantly similar to judgments made not about thought experiments but in real life. And it's not specifically philosophical, because it's just judgments about cases and judgments using ordinary categories of, for example, knowledge and morality. And very similar remarks apply to other thought experiments, in different areas of philosophy where the verdicts might, well, I've used words like no, that's what I've been talking about, but also intend to, if people are interested in theories of action, what counts as an intended action, theories of causation. And none of those are technical terms of philosophy. They're just very common words which are used in both everyday life and in many specialized contexts. So there's nothing particularly philosophical about these intuitions. And the trouble with the negative program, or one trouble with the negative program, is that it risks becoming a critique of unreflective judgment in general. Right? That because it isn't confined to thought experiments, but the same critique, if it worked, would apply to all sorts of online judgments just about particular cases that we encounter in life. And in fact, the skepticism would become even more general than that, because it's something like just a critique of unreflective judgment in general that we make about cases where we just think, oh, he doesn't know, or he didn't intend that, or whatever, without some process of conscious reflection. But even in cases of reflective judgment, where a process of conscious reflection has occurred, they too depend on unreflective judgments for the individual steps of reflection. I mean, for example, if you're doing a calculation in mathematics, let's say you're adding up a whole lot of numbers, then that's a reflective process, because you have to think about what you're doing and so on. But each individual step that together make up this process of calculation, the individual steps are not themselves reflective. You just make them, and so in that way, it seems that all reflective judgment depends on unreflective judgment. And so if unreflective judgment is problematic, then the reflective judgments will be problematic too, because the unreflective judgments that they're built from will be problematic. And so the negative program risks becoming indirectly a critique of all judgment, and so turning just into some kind of general skepticism. And that's very much not what followers of XFI want. They don't want to become general skeptics, because if they became general skeptics, that would also be a threat to science, whereas the experimental philosophers love natural science and really think that philosophy should become more like it. So another problem which I want to say something about for experimental philosophy, particularly for the negative program, not so much for the positive program, is that the followers of XFI have not shown how philosophy could work under their restrictions. I mean, supposing that we just were to accept the restrictions that experimental philosophers impose, so that we wouldn't just rely on judgments about thought experiments. And instead, we used experimental methods to find out what ordinary people thought about these cases and so on. So what the experimental methods would tell us is that maybe if things go well, they would tell us that most people agree, let's say, that murder is wrong. I mean, that you could presumably, insofar as these kind of questionnaires and so on are reliable, you can find out what most people think, and let's assume that most people do agree that murder is wrong. But the fact that most people agree that murder is wrong is just a fact about the psychology of people, about what beliefs they have. It's not in itself a philosophical conclusion at all. And so if we were interested in the moral conclusion, I mean, supposing we're doing moral philosophy, we want to make some determinations about which things are right and which are wrong. We're not interested in what most people agree is wrong. We're interested in what is wrong. So, I mean, the relevant conclusion would be the moral conclusion that murder is wrong. But how do we get from what the experiments would show, which is that, let's suppose, most people agree that murder is wrong, to the conclusion, the moral conclusion, that murder is wrong? Now, we could bridge the gap if we had the extra premise that if most people agree to a proposition, then it's true. But the thing is, what entitles us to that extra premise? Why should we accept this extra premise that what most people agree on is true? And of course, we could do some more experimental philosophy on that extra premise. We could ask people what they thought about it. And maybe, I don't know, but maybe we could find out that most people would agree that the extra premise is true. In other words, they would agree that if most people would agree that if most people agree to a proposition, then it's true. But even if we got that result, that's still just another psychological conclusion. It's not a philosophical one. The extra premise we need is that, or what we need is the conclusion that the extra premise is true. But all we're getting is that most people agree to it. And so there's a kind of infinite regress here, because what we need at each stage of the argument, if we're interested in the moral question, is not facts about what most people think, but just facts about what's right or wrong. And so the experiments are not giving us information about the questions that we're interested in. They're really changing the subject. They're giving us information about some psychological questions about what most people think. But those are not the questions that we're primarily interested in, for example, moral philosophy. So for all those reasons, I regard the negative program as a failure. I don't think that it's cast really serious doubt on the method of thought experiments, and I don't think that it's proposing, as far as I can see, a workable alternative to the kinds of method that we're using in philosophy for answering the kind of questions that we want to answer, which are not psychological questions, but are questions about moral philosophy or epistemology or whatever it is. But although the negative program fails, I think maybe it does contain a real insight, although not the one that the experimental philosophers have mainly emphasized, but one that does come up in some of their work, and that concerns the idea of error fragility. So let me explain what that is. So an error fragile method is one in which a small error in the input can lead to large errors in the output. So as it were, if we're engaged in some kind of cognitive enterprise where one little mistake can have very bad consequences cognitively. And I think an example of an error fragile method is what we might call naive falsificationism, which is a kind of maybe an unfair simplification of Karl Popper's philosophy of science. So naive falsificationism involves rejecting conjectures on the basis of a single counterexample. Now, the naive falsificationists, they're right about the basic logical point that if the counterexample is correct, then the theory is false, assuming that the theory is some kind of universal generalization, then one counterexample is enough to show that it's false. So they're right about that basic logical point. The trouble is that if the counterexample relies on bad data, then the theory may still be true. So if the thing that we're using as a counterexample, if that depends on some mistake that we've made, then we risk rejecting a true theory. And if we're just thinking in terms of, one counterexample is enough, then we may reject that true theory forever and waste all our time afterwards looking at various false theories when, in fact, we had the true theory in our hands, but we rejected it because of what we mistakenly took to be a counterexample. And so naive falsificationism is an error-fragile method because one mistake with one piece of data is enough to cause a cognitive disaster where you reject the correct theory forever. Now, the thing to observe about the standard philosophical use of thought experiments is that the way philosophers have been doing it, it does involve a kind of naive falsificationism. Even though the counterexamples are coming from thought experiments rather than from ordinary experiments. So, the philosophical version of this method would be that a philosophical conjecture is rejected if one thought experiment seems to provide a thought. Sorry, that's another mistake in the slide. It says seems to provide a thought experiment, but I mean, it should say seems to provide a counterexample. And so the standard philosophical use of thought experiments is error fragile, because we could reject a correct philosophical conjecture forever just on the basis of one one thought experiment where you've made a mistake. Now, I think it's important to be clear on the nature of the problem. So idiosyncratic errors in thought experiments are not a serious problem. By idiosyncratic errors, I mean errors that are just one person either being a bit crazy or having a bad day or whatever, one person on a particular occasion. And that's not a big problem, because in philosophy, thought experiments get considered by many members of the philosophical community before being accepted. They're published in articles, and then there's some discussion, and then they may or may not be accepted as good counterexamples. So I think the just individual errors are going to be, they're not going to survive that kind of filtering. So they're not the problem. The serious problem is when there's an error in judging a thought experiment, which results from a bug in a more or less universal human cognitive capacity. Because then the bug may produce agreement on a false verdict on the thought experiment. So the kind of error that we have to worry about is where there's, as it were, something about the way human beings think or cognize in general, not just some particular individual, which produces errors. And one thing that's noticeable is that normal experimental philosophy methods would not identify such a bug in a universal human cognitive capacity, because if there were such a bug, we would still get agreement amongst all or most humans about the verdict on the thought experiment, but the verdict would be incorrect. So the question is whether there could be such bugs, and actually they are possible, because one way such a bug could result is from some kind of unconscious innate heuristic, some kind of quick and easy way of making unreflective judgments, which is reliable in normal conditions, but not 100% reliable. And human beings do use such heuristics, and we sometimes go wrong because of them. So, an example of a heuristic that we use, not so relevant in philosophy, but it just to show the kind of thing, is that in perception, we often use color as a guide to shape, so that where there's a clear color boundary between red and green or something, then we tend to take that as indicating that's the end of one object and the beginning of another, or something like that. I mean, this is all, of course, but it's bound up in the workings of the visual system, and it's much more complicated than that. But that's the basic idea. And of course, if we use color as a guide to shape, then a lot of the time that's going to give us accurate results, but sometimes it's going to give us wrong results. And one way that happens is actually it's exploited by military camouflage, where things are disguised by being painted in such a way that the color boundaries don't at all correspond to the shape boundaries. And camouflage works because of the way the human perceptual system works. I mean, you could call it a glitch, but or I call it a bug, but it may in fact be that such a system is is a very good thing to have, that the heuristic that it's using is maybe very efficient, and that the errors it produces are relatively minor. Now, of course, the case of using color as a guide to shape, that's a perceptual heuristic, and that one is not particularly likely to lead us into philosophical error. So a further question is whether there are heuristics which could lead us into errors in thought experiments. And I think, unfortunately, the answer to that question is yes, there are. And actually, I've already mentioned one of those heuristics, which is the heuristic for assessing conditionals, that to assess a conditional of the form if P, then Q, you assess Q on the basis of the supposition P, and then you take the same attitude unconditionally to the conditional if P, then Q that you took to Q on the supposition of P. Now, that's in general, that's a pretty good way of assessing conditionals. And it's important for us because it exploits a lot of, in effect, knowledge that we have of the world, which is not in the form of explicit generalizations, but in the form of dispositions to update either online or offline in certain reality-oriented ways. But that heuristic for assessing conditionals is in fact somewhat problematic, even though it's mostly reliable. And one can show that under certain circumstances, it can lead to inconsistencies. I mean, I'm not going to go into the details of that, but if you're curious about it, the problems with it are explained in my book, Suppose and Tell, the Semantics and Heuristics of Conditionals, which came out a few months ago. But what we're concerned with is a heuristic, which I think is, as far as I can tell, it's pretty much a human universal to assess conditionals that way. It's a good thing that we have it because it's mostly reliable, but it can lead to inconsistencies and therefore into incorrect judgments in certain circumstances. And so it is the kind of thing that can produce errors in thought experiments. And in fact, I think that one reason why it's been so difficult to reach conclusions about the semantics and logic of conditionals is because the judgments that we're making about which conditionals are correct and which are incorrect based on this heuristic are not 100% reliable. And so I think as a result of that, we actually have been rejecting a correct theory of conditionals, which is basically that conditional, the fundamental form of the conditional just is the truth functional conditional of modern propositional logic. So the question is, if we're making some mistakes in thought experiments because of bugs in the universal human cognitive capacity, how are we going to identify such bugs? And I want to emphasize that I'm not arguing that thought experiments are a bad method. I think that thought experiments in general are a good method, but as I've been emphasizing in these lectures, I mean, all human cognitive capacities are fallible, and the imagination as a cognitive capacity certainly inherits some of that fallibility, and so it's inevitable that sometimes we will make mistakes. We'll make false judgments about thought experiments. And so it's important that we have some way of recognizing when that's going on, so that we don't fall victim to the kind of error fragility that I've been talking about, where we reject a philosophical theory that may be a correct philosophical theory forever on the basis of a thought experiment. And it will be, if that happens, it will be likely a thought experiment where, in general, human beings agree on the verdict, but that agreement is caused by a glitch or a bug in the heuristic that they're using. Of course, something that I said about the case of conditionals indicates one way that we may be able to recognize that there is a bug in the heuristic that we're relying on, and that's because in the case of the heuristic that I argue we're relying on in the case of conditionals, you can show that it's actually internally inconsistent, so it can't be fully correct. But in order to do that, one does have to do quite a lot of analysis of just what the heuristic is that we're relying on to formulate it to the point where you can analyze its logical properties and see whether it's consistent or not. But in other cases, it could be that it's not that the heuristic that we're using is actually inconsistent. There might be some other way in which, in certain circumstances, it's erroneous, and we still have to be able to identify those errors in order not to fall victim to error fragility. So I think what we need are some other kind of techniques to use in philosophy that can act as a corrective when needed to errors that we may make in our assessments of thought experiments. And I think in general, well-confirmed theories about a domain help us identify bugs in our heuristics for that domain. Once we have more general theories, which have quite a lot of confirmation, then I think when their support is sufficiently good, we should be suspicious of attempts to refute them by a single thought experiment. And it may be that it's the general theory that is correct and the thought experiment that is wrong. And so such a clash can alert us to the possibility that we're making a mistake. And so what I'm going to be doing in the next lecture on Monday is considering how to obtain and assess general theories in philosophy. In other words, to deal with the problem of how we can compare different philosophical theories of the same domain to decide which is better. And I think we've got to be willing to work at that more theoretical level, as well as at the level of thought experiments, in order to get some kind of counterbalance to the weight of individual judgments on thought experiments. So just to emphasize, I'm not rejecting the use of thought experiments. I think they're very valuable. They're an important source of evidence. But like all sources of evidence, they're fallible, and so we mustn't rely purely on the method of thought experiments. We have to have other methods so that when one method is going wrong, the other method can alert us to the problem. Thank you very much.
Start. Anyone hear me?
Hello?
Hello? Can anyone hear me?
Yeah, I can, yeah.
I think it seems that Professor Chenbo should give something kind of introduction of ours, so then we can start, or shall we just start directly?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yes. Okay. Sorry, I don't open my.
Oh, Mike.
Yeah. Sorry. Yes. Thanks, Professor. Thank you, Professor Williamson, for his lecture. Now we come into the next section. Interlocutor and questioner. I give a very short introduction to him, to them. Dr. Li Qilin receives his PhD from McWest University in Canada in 2013. Now he is an assistant professor at the Department of Philosophy, Peking University. He specializes in epistemology and the philosophy of language. Dr. Wang Hongguang is currently a postdoctoral research fellow at Peking University. She is also the co-Chinese translator of Williamson's book, The Philosophy of Philosophy. Yes, when Li Qilin and Wang Hongguang gave their comments and questions, then Professor Williamson gave his reply. Then we add an extra question from Professor Wang Jin. Okay? Do you can hear?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
So shall I start?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. So first of all, thank Professor Williamson for this wonderful lecture on thought experiment. I think everyone will learn a lot from his this wonderful lecture and got a lot of insightful inspiration from him. And my comments actually do not indicate any strong disagreement with Professor Williamson. What I want to do in this comments probably would provide a certain kind of supportive evidence from Chinese philosophy and from our perspective. Then we can, I probably will ask some clarification questions, and we want to know more information from, we want to get more information from Professor Williamson on how he think about those cases. So first of all, I think in Chinese philosophy we also have certain kind of thought experiments, like the one indicated in this left part is kind of the picture of Chinese philosopher Zhuangzi is called the dream, Zhuangzi's dream of butterfly. So that indicated Zhuangzi fell into sleep, and in the dream, he think he become a butterfly. But the dream is so vivid and make him confused whether in actual world he is Zhuangzi who fell into sleep and dreaming that he transformed into a butterfly in the dream, or actually it is the butterfly who fell into sleep and dream, but the butterfly transformed into Zhuangzi. So that is the Chinese thought experiments that is thought experiment in Chinese philosophy. So arguably it can be interpreted in various ways, whether this kind of thought experiments is equivalent or similar to the epistemic skeptical scenario like brain event, or some other kind of relative, certain kind of thought experiments for relativism. So it's open question. And another example I pick up is on the right side is Confucius. He provides certain kind of thought experiment to indicate that we have certain kind of indication or certain kind of signal to indicate that their inside us there is a certain kind of say benevolence. So when you can consider when you see a very young kid just in danger to fall into the well, so you can feel the psychological reaction to probably rush to help the kid save him from the danger. So that is Chinese. I think it's very typical Chinese thought experiment in Chinese philosophy. And also I'm quite impressed by Professor Williamson's thought on the online versus offline model of application of cognitive faculties. And actually we can, with this kind of theoretical tools in our mind, actually we can give a better understanding about scientific research as well. So we can see how scientists design their they can use the thought experiment as a tool to design certain kind of to make certain kind of theoretical predictions. Then they can also design certain kind of experimental device, try to detect those kind of things that's predicted by the theory. If there are such kind of data that observed by the device, then the theory probably is confirmed. Otherwise, it's just give a certain kind of indication of rejection of the theory. So here's one example concerning the test of existence of the ether. That is the Michael-Morley experiment. So they try to do, in first step, they do certain kind of thought experiments, trying to use the theory to predict that if there are, or there is the ether in the universe, so the light from the angle or will have certain kind of influence among each other, and the speed of light of the movement will change. So the second step, they just do certain kind of real life experiment to design certain kind of experiment to test whether such kind of significant difference could be observed. And then it turned out that no such significance is observed by this kind of device. So the conclusion is that there's no such thing like ether in the universe. Ether is not a carrier of the light wave. So we can see that this kind of offline thought connect with online experiment go smoothly side by side to make their contributions to in science. So that is, I think, this kind of the offline and online modes of application of cognitive faculties give us a better explanations on how to understand the scientific activity or scientific performance in a better way. I think is a very insightful thing. And then I want to give some of my comments or asking for certain kind of clarification from Professor Williamson. So Professor Williamson tried to give a certain kind of argument against experimental philosophy, especially when experimental philosophers regard the faculty that philosophers try to use in the thought experiment is so-called philosophical intuition. So, but they cannot hold this kind of thing properly because once the original purpose to provide a certain kind of critique of philosophical intuitions, but then this kind of thing will gradually become or have certain kind of risk to becoming critical and reflect judgment, and then become indirect critic of all judgment. And so it should seem like the experimental philosopher has to take certain kind of skeptical position with everyday cognitive judgment, something like that. But as Professor Williamson indicated in his talk, the follower of experimental philosophy do not want to become such general skeptics, since they do not want to cause threats to science. But I just wonder whether this kind of thing really, I want to say, what is the real problem, or what is the real nature of this kind of argument? Why experimental philosophy would have this kind of problem, like they become certain kind of general skeptics. I wonder whether it's because of because the concept of philosophical intuition. For example, if they give up this kind of idea and try to argue, say some other thing, like say, okay, the thought experiments is just certain kind of say fast mode versus slow mode thinking, or they can also sometimes probably can just explain, okay, that's certain kind of cognitive faculty that develops throughout the human evolution, something like that. And sometime later on, I will give one example concerning the contextualism. I think probably they can just suggest that when philosophers do some thought experiments, they do have certain kind of suspicious taste sometimes. I will show this kind of thing in a minute. So that is one question. The other one is concerning the infinite regress things. So from if experimental philosopher got certain data to indicate that most people agree to certain proposition, and what is left unanswered is whether that proposition is really true. If they want to establish this kind of connection between agreement of the proposition and the truth of the proposition, it seems that they have to search for certain kind of exact promise, and then in order to establish the validity or the truth of this exact promise, probably they have need another exact promise, and go on and on. So that is the general general model of the argument, which indicated probably experimental philosophy will commit to certain kind of infinite regress problem. But I just wonder whether this kind of thing is kind of anti-psychologist approach. Can experimental philosophy just take certain kind of, can they just give up the requirement for the truth of the proposition? Like, especially when we talk about certain kind of moral theories or social theories, can we just say the most important thing is that we find out that within certain kind of community, majority of the people agree to a certain proposition because certain kind of scientific reason, or we can just give some other, say, cultural convention or certain kind of the way how the member of the community cultivated and how they learned from the older generation, something like that. And then or some other, say, when most people in the community agree to certain proposition, this group will have certain kind of evolutionary advantage. And the thing is that I think in a quite natural way, probably we will satisfy with this kind of explanation. We do not want, we probably want to question this kind of explanation further, unless we have certain very strong philosophical, not intuitive, probably philosophical curiosity to say, oh, why the evolutionary theories is correct, or why this kind of agreement to the kind of proposition will bring the evolutionary adventure to the group. But I think, according to this kind of infinite regress thing, it's really kind of philosophical style, because in everyday life we somehow will got certain kind of answer and become satisfied and stop asking for further one. So the question is that I would just wonder, because experimental philosophy is still kind of philosophy, so they will this kind of ask for further premise and do this kind of a thing endlessly, or whether they can have some other alternative way to treat this kind of problem. So in that case, the infinite regress problem is just a potential problem. It's not a real one. They just they can in real life they do not have the kind of problem. They can stop certain stage and accept certain kind of scientific explanation of just the first premise. Once they find out the majority agreement that they're satisfied. So that's another question. Okay. So I think from one of the suggestions that this kind of infinite regress problem is kind of thing that is based upon the conceptual difference, which philosopher got very sensitive. That is difference between agreement to a proposition and the conception of the truth proposition. They are different concepts. We think, okay, there's a gap between them. We should find certain kind of premise to fix that, or to bring those kind of the gap. But when we try to find those kind of thing, the bridge theory or the bridge statement become, suspicious. We have to justify that bridge proposition or bridge statement. So that is really certain kind of philosophical curiosity. But in everyday, I think in most cases, sometimes we just satisfied with certain kind of scientific ones, and we stop to question the validity of scientific scientific theory when we got them as a certain kind of explanation. So that's my worry, because experimental philosophy, I think they are, if not all of them are naturalists, then most of them, I think, will take certain kind of naturalist view. They will satisfy with scientific one, so they are not going, they won't become to one that perform this kind of infinite regress inquiries, I think. So that is the question. Then I want to ask Professor Williamson for further clarification concerning the thought experiment in philosophy and certain kind of supportive thing, because in most part of your talk, you mentioned that the thought experiments is kind of a thing that serve as a counterexample for against a certain theory, like what Galileo did for against Aristotle, or Gettier example against GTB account, something like that. But in philosophy, actually, we have another style to use thought experiments. Like we use thought experiment as certain kind of database or as certain kind of input. We think the phenomena indicated in the thought experiments is the information or the data we should explain by certain kind of philosophical theory. For example, here is the very famous case pair in contemporary contextualism, which is designed by Professor Keynes de Rose, like bank case A and bank case B. So bank case A is, generally speaking, is very ordinary one. So Keynes and his wife go to the bank on Friday and found there's a long line in the bank there. Since they do not have any emergency thing, so they do not want a waiting line, and so they decide to come on Saturday. So the question is whether Keynes know that the bank is open on Saturday. In case one, which is low stake and no relevant out information in this case, Keynes could reasonably suggest that he knows that the bank is open on Saturday because he just went 2 weeks ago on Saturday and find out that the bank was open at the time. Then we have another case which compare with case one. The case B is high stake and relevant alternative mentioned case, right? I emphasize those kind of highlight sentence indicate the difference between case one.
Sorry to interrupt, Dr. Li, Professor Li Qilin. Could you be shorter?
Yeah, I will just finish actually. Yeah,
Okay.
And this kind of thing I think give a certain kind of theoretical thing, like they want to provide certain kind of theoretical support to take knowing as certain kind of context sensitive, but we do have certain kind of debate concerning the phenomena whether the case is really there, right? We have certain kind of psychological effect, like certain kind of framing effect, primary effect. When we change the order of the case A and the case B, probably the case just dissolved, or we have some other explanation like psychological belief, authorized belief versus non-authorized belief to explain this kind of data. So I just wonder whether Professor Williamson think this is another way to use a thought experiment in philosophy, and whether this kind of way is more suspicious or more worrisome for us. So I think that's all. Thank you. Sorry for this long comment. Sorry. Yeah, I finished. Yeah.
Okay. Wang Hongguang, show up. Wang Hongguang? Where is Wang Hongguang? Too long. Short. Cut your long question to short. Okay? Wang Hongguang, cut your long question to short. Not too long. Oh, so long list.
I'm not sure. Can you see my screen?
No, I don't see your slide.
Sorry.
At first, he showed up a wire, but disappear immediately. Oh. Not too long. Short, okay?
Oh, sorry.
All this slides. So too long. Yeah.
I'm sorry. At beginning, I want to thank Professor Williamson for the informative lecture. I have two questions to ask. The first is why not evaluate the role of imagination and the thought experiments in context of discovery? This question relates to the understanding of the distinction between context of discovery and the context of justification. To my knowledge, it is a distinction between the psychological process and the logical arguments. Context of discovery concerns the psychological connections between thoughts. Context of justification concerns only logical connections. Context of discovery is descriptive. Context of justification is normative. In Professor Williamson's example, the thought experiment is a model argument, and the major premise of the argument is a counterfactual conditional whose antecedent is a scenario we counterfactually suppose in imagine. Professor Williamson tells us the imaginative process of assessing conditionals is no different from method of thinking through possible situations we often use in everyday decision making. And the logic of counterfactuals can explain how do we know that scenario is possible. But in normative context of justification, what logic tells us is that scenario is possible, and we could or should know that scenario is possible. Similarly, logic tells us we could and should know how to imaginally assess conditionals. However, this has nothing to do with how imagination is used in making thought experiments work. It is true that a logic argument is neither mysterious nor distinctive to philosophy, but it does not imply it is also true for the thinking process, which is represented by the argument. So we also need to do philosophical research on imagination and thought experiments in the context of discovery, or at least by doing so, we may find that they are not mysterious, unless the relevant philosophical research can only be done in the context of justification. The second question is how to distinguish between so-called thought experiment and the purely hypothetical or imaginative reasoning. This question relates to the understanding of thought experiments. The composition of the term indicates thought experiments should have both a hypothetical or imaginative side and an experimental side. Professor Williamson mentions thought experiments in ancient Greek, Indian, and Chinese philosophy. As far as I know, there's a long tradition of hypothetical or imaginative reasoning in Chinese philosophical texts. Many scholars in both Western and Chinese philosophy have used the category of thought experiment to classify such reasoning, such as the following passage from Mengzi, Child at the Well, very short, but perhaps the most famous. Mengzi argued that all humans innately possessed dispositions towards virtuous feelings, including a disposition towards benevolence. Dr. Li Qilin just introduced this example. The next is the original text. Mengzi said, I say that all people have a heart that is not indifferent towards others because of falling. Suppose someone suddenly saw a child about to fall into a well. Anyone in such a situation would have a feeling of alarm and compassion, not because one thought to get in good with the child's parents, not because one wanted fame amongst one's neighbors and friends, not because one would dislike the sound of child's cries. If it is legitimate to say that Mengzi used a thought experiment, it will exemplify Professor Williamson's conclusion that the role of imagination in thought experiments is no more special than in everyday counterfactual thinking. But as a thought experiment, this hypothetical or imaginative reasoning seems to lack a experimental side. It lacks something to examine in the sense of falsification. Of course, if we add such a thing to make a thought experiment in contemporary sense, that's another thing. I think this is an even more urgent question in the context of justification. Thank you.
Okay. Tim.
Right.
Yeah.
So thank you both for those points and questions. And it's really nice to get those examples, which I think from traditional Chinese philosophy, which I'm very happy to classify as thought experiments, and the case of the child going near the well, and where I think we can all instinctively just start to want to protect or most of us do something to prevent the child falling in. It's interesting because I mean that case, it isn't a thought experiment, but it's not particularly there as a counterexample, unless it's meant to be a counterexample to some claim that people don't feel benevolence. But it seems more like a way of discovering that this is what is a normal human reaction, which is a benevolent one. And I think in relation to what Hong Guang was saying about it, I think there is an element of experiment about it, because what we're doing is we're imagining the scenario of the child crawling towards the well, and then we're judging, well, how's somebody going to feel in those circumstances, and I think we can tell from our own reactions that they're going to their instinct is to protect the child, and so that's, it's a very small kind of a thought experiment, but it is one. I mean, after all, it's a test of whether our reaction is a benevolent one, or whether it's just amusement at the idea of the child falling into the well, or indifference, or whatever. So on going back to Chilin's comments, and I also I liked his discussion of the Michelson-Morley experiment and the way in which, with quite normal scientific experiments, the imagination may also play a role there. And I think one thing that it would be useful to do is again to separate the role of what's, as it were, the context of discovery versus context of justification, because I think in some cases what's happening is that the imagination, as it were, we imagine a certain sort of experiment, but then we think of the experimental scenario, and then we can simply, let's say, calculate from the theory what its prediction is. But I think it may, and that's really context of discovery, I take it. But I think in many cases, particularly where we're dealing with theories that don't have, just a completely mathematical formulation, the extracting predictions from the theory may also involve a use of the imagination in the context of justification by because we're using it to test predictions of the form, if the theory were true, then such and such would happen in the experimental scenario. And I think in less formal cases, we may need to do that, where it's not all, the theory isn't just completely explicit. And so I think, it's not something I said very much. We didn't really talk about it in the talk, but I think it may well be true that if one explores a lot of, as it were, real life scientific experiments, one will find that the imagination is playing a role in assessing conditionals to do with what would be the case if the theory were true. And so I think there's a very fertile area for explanation there. You were asking about whether we had to really had to bother, or whether experimental philosophers would bother about the distinction between truth and what people agree in, and so I think, of course, if somebody's a complete eliminativist or about morality, I mean, regards morality as simply some kind of illusion, then they won't be interested in the question of truth. But of course, even arguing for such eliminativism about morality itself requires philosophical argument. It's not something that could just be, even if we found that lots of ordinary people were eliminativists, I don't think they are, but if we did, that still wouldn't be a good philosophical case for eliminativism. And I think even if one has a somewhat reductionist view that I mean, it's not very like, I mean, if you have an evolutionary view about morality, it's not likely to be a reduction of what's right and wrong to what people think is right and wrong. It may be a reduction to what aids the survival of the species or whatever, and so that would still be something where there was a difference between truth and what people thought. But I think for even some experimental philosophers may be open to the idea that there are errors in the kind of morality that is generally agreed. That, I mean, for example, that even if most people most people think that it's fine to eat meat, it seems that you might think there's a real question about whether we're simply, all humans are just agreeing on a certain form of treatment of animals, which in fact is morally inappropriate. And I think also, the case of course, morality isn't the only case where these issues arise. And if we're talking about thought experiments in epistemology and thought experiments, in philosophy of action or on theory of causation or whatever, then I think even for experimental philosophers, it will be hard to say that there's no gap between agreement and truth. I think, they may well want to say that there are common illusions about knowledge or whatever, and so I think that I don't think they can use. I mean, I agree. Of course, they are usually naturalists, but I don't think their naturalism is going to enable them just to kind of wipe out the bridge between truth and agreement. In fact, naturalists are often more willing than others to attribute error to very widely held human beliefs. The final issue that you were raising was about the database use of thought experiments, and I think the database. So you were giving the example of thought experiments which support contextualism and epistemology, and I think in a way that's just the other side of the use of them for counterexamples, because of course when we if we even on the simplest model where we're doing a kind of naive falsificationism with them, if we're using them to refute certain theories, then I mean, every thought experiment that has refuted an old theory, it kind of goes into our database automatically, because we're looking for a better theory that will not be refuted by the results that the data that we've got from the thought experiments, which has refuted the old theories, and so and in the case of contextualism, if these thought experiments work in the way that for someone like De Rose wants them to work, then they will refute invariantism about the semantics of epistemic terms, and then they'll support contextualism because it can supposedly explain the results of these thought experiments better. So I think it's definitely right that they have this databases, but I think that's really making explicit something that's implicit in the idea that they can provide potential counterexamples. And then, so I think there was quite a bit of agreement between us there. So, and then going on to Hong Wang's questions. So I think it's a bit more complicated than just the context of discovery aligning with psychology and the context of justification aligning with logic, because the context of justification also has a psychological aspect to it, because any kind of reasoning processes have to be instantiated, as it were, within human psychology, and I think, and in particular, in the case of the thought experiments. So you were saying that that logic should tell us that scenario is possible, but logic, at least in the sense of formal deductive logic or something like that, it can't really do very much about possibility. I mean, we may be able to show that a certain scenario is logically consistent, but that doesn't really mean that it's possible. So, for example, if we take the case of Phosphorus and Hesperus, which are just two different names for the planet Venus, if we take the claim that Hesperus is distinct from Phosphorus, that claim is logically completely consistent, because logic, as it were, doesn't know whether those are two names for the same object or not. And in fact, although it's logically consistent, it's not something which is regarded as objectively possible. I mean, for example, Kripke's arguments in naming and necessity. And so I think a lot of our judgments of what's possible and our judgments of conditionals as well, although logic has a role to play in that, I think with many of the conditionals I was talking about in the lecture, logic will not help you to decide very much about whether they're true or not. I mean, and well, in the case of the one with scenario I was talking about, I mean, the key judgment was that the murder was bad, but it's not pure logic that tells you that murder is bad. It's something much richer, which has a rational side, but also has a psychological side. And so I think that, and even of course in the context of discovery, I think, as philosophers of science have emphasized, I mean, it's not as though rationality is completely absent from the discovery side. It's often there are the thought processes that lead to, as it were, the having an idea are often themselves rational processes. So I think it's the relation between as it were, the psychological side and the rational side is quite complex, in part because human rationality, as it were, has to be psychologically realized. And then on the second question, so that was about the relation between thought experiments and hypothetical thinking. And I'm not drawing a big distinction between those two. So I think that thought experiments involve hypothetical thinking of a of a rather developed kind. I mean, there can be examples of hypothetical thinking which is so simple that we wouldn't really describe them as thought experiments. But I think that's just a matter of complexity. And then, I think I said something about this earlier, but that in relation to the experimental side, I think that just has to do with the judgment that we make about the consequent of the conditional. I mean, for example, that and it might be something like I would want to save the child or something like that. But it doesn't have to be a very elaborate experiment. It's just that there's a further judgment which is elicited when we imaginatively suppose the antecedent of the conditional, and which is not just, as it were, a mechanical logical consequence of it, or an obvious logical consequence of it. Okay, thank you.
Okay, Professor Williamson, do you like still to answer another extra question?
Yes, I'm happy to do that.
Okay. And then I leave a final question to Professor Wang Jin. Show up quickly. Okay.
Dear Professor Williamson, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I can.
Thank you for your lecture, and thank you, Professor Chen Bo, for giving me the precious opportunity for question. My name is Jin Wang, come from Sanxi University. As we know, philosophers not only do the thought experiments, but also do the real experiments using measuring instruments, such as in philosophy of mind and epistemology, etc. In China, Professor Cao Jianbo, maybe you know Professor Cao Jianbo, who comes from Xiamen University. He investigates what knowledge is in public eyes. He also introduces the function, operation, and possible applications in philosophy of fMRI, that is functional magnetic resonance imaging. What I want to ask Professor Williams is whether there could be a conflict between these two kind of experiments in philosophy, or how the collaboration could affect the development of philosophy in future. Thank you. This is my question.
Thank you. So I don't think that in principle the need, there has to be a conflict between the two kinds of experiment. I mean, it might be that if for some special reason the experiments of one kind seem to suggest something in conflict with what was being suggested by experiments of another kind, but that can also happen between different experiments of the very same type. I mean, I don't think I got all your examples, but the ones that I got, they seem to be, as it were, in some broad sense, experimental investigations of common belief about various things, and I think that, I mean, of course, that's a perfectly legitimate thing to do. There's a question about exactly which philosophical questions it's meant to, to cast light on. I mean, so that it isn't just a kind of sociological investigation. But I think on the whole, the kind of thought experiments that I've been discussing are ones which seem to draw on fairly basic bits of human cognitive apparatus, which on the whole seem to be pretty widely shared. But of course, if we ask about things which where, as it were, culture plays a much larger role, then we're definitely going to get different results. And so, for example, I mean, suppose that we're interested in a question like how widely shared are conspiracy theories about coronavirus or something like that. I mean, those are not just drawing on basic human cognitive apparatus. They're also to do very much with what kind of social media people are exposed to, and there it's. I mean, those are questions which really could not be answered by thought experiments, because thought experiments are not, conducted by philosophers are not sensitive to the kinds of social and cultural facts which those kind of, as it were, empirical studies are picking up on, and so I think it's a lot of the time it's a question of using the appropriate methods for different kinds of question.
Okay.
So, thank you for your question.
Yes, thank all of you, Professor Williamson, Professor Li Qilin, Dr. Wang Hongguang, Professor Wang Jing. Let's meet together here next Monday night.
Yes, I think Sebastian has a question, or he had a hand. I did, but maybe that was some other.
Another question.
I wasn't sure whether Sebastian was raising it. Maybe it wasn't.
Okay.
It was not a question. I was clapping.
Oh, I see. Oh, okay. Then sorry. Sorry to misinterpret. Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Let us meet together here next Monday night.
Okay.
Professor Williamson's 5th lecture, Philosophy and Theory Comparison.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
See you.
See you then. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.